So Chen, we're back here talking about another case study. This time it's a client profile where it's a married couple, David and Lena. Both actually were previously married and had brought children from their previous marriage into this new blended family. Their circumstance was, Lena makes about 125K. David makes about 65K as a consultant through his own corporation. Lena seems to have more of the assets that she brings into this family. She has a recreational property, which I think is a cottage. She also has registered investment portfolio as well, right? They actually do have some sort of basic documentation set up, but there was a couple of unique priorities on Lena's part. She has one of her children has special needs, and so that's a long-term commitment for her on how to support that child. And her mother, an aging parent, also is reliant on Lena for support and long-term stability.
Right.
So this was kind of the makeup of what their situation was. And where was the starting point for you in this case study?
Yeah, just when we really had a quick conversation with Lena and David, I mean, their intent was pretty straightforward. Like, they want an estate plan that obviously protects all the different stakeholders, and family members just in general. They wanted to make sure it was fair to everybody around at the end of the day, because what typically happens is they do have the documents, but there are some unintended consequences that can come up with that documents, and they wanted to see what they needed to do to be able to help address those concerns.
For this, when you had the discovery with them, and how would you characterize what the key risks were? Because they had actually used an online platform to create a will.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people who've done that.
Absolutely.
And that's a great thing, because it's better to have that than no will.
Yeah, exactly.
But given the nuanced situation, like where did that land them in regards to what they wanted?
Yeah.
And they were being proactive in some ways, but given their unique circumstance, how was that kind of related to what they had?
Yeah, absolutely. So blended families are always a bit more different than, let's say, a pretty straightforward, family per se. So yeah, to your point, I mean, it's very important to make sure you at least have some documents than none. But unfortunately, in a blended family, it actually assumes a couple of things, right? I mean, it actually assumes that you're never going to remarry, in a relationship at the end of the day. And unfortunately, in a blended family, you might disinherit your own children unintentionally by doing a straightforward will, which passes your assets to the other spouse, especially when both spouses came into the marriage with their own children. The second part of it is Lena did come into the relationship with a little bit more wealth in comparison to David. So we do want to be able to make sure that we can avoid any future claims, from a long-term perspective, spousal claims, or even like children, for example. So we needed to be able to address that piece of it. The third one definitely is, given that there were children with special needs as well as aging parents, Lena does obviously have significant commitments that she wants to take care of. So we wanted to be able to address that, straight on without leaving that up chance from a long-term perspective. And the second last one, there were some asset ownerships and beneficiary designations within their current portfolio, which would bypass the probate process and go directly to the beneficiary. While it's great for certain aspects like minimizing cost of probate cost and tax minimization, it does have unintended consequences when it comes to obviously certain things going to a beneficiary directly. Again, disinheriting your own children, so we wanted to be able to address that. And the last part of the risk that we really looked at was, is there sufficient liquidity if something was to happen to either David or Lena? Because we really want to make sure that the parents are not forced to take certain action just to have liquidity in those kind of circumstances.
So then the risks then are summarized into 5 major points, right? So there's blended family risk. There is unequal estates and potential spousal claims. There is dependence with ongoing needs. There is asset ownership and beneficiary mismatch. And there is a lack of liquidity, specifically given some of the unique circumstances here that translate into a very strong need for capital.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what was your strategy for these 5 risk factors?
Yeah. So there were a ton of different solutions we could have considered. So I'll maybe go through a few of them just for the purpose of the case study today. One of the things we actually considered was a spousal trust. The spousal trust, what it ultimately does is, in case something happens to one spouse, we can make sure, the assets are now transferred into a trust for the benefit of the second spouse. What it also accomplishes is that when the second spouse passes away, it doesn't go down to the beneficiaries in her own estate or in his own estate. It will make sure that when the assets are transferred to the trust, after that second spouse passes away, it can actually be redistributed amongst any beneficiaries. So in a circumstance like this, if David was to pass away, Lena would be able to enjoy the properties and everything else and make sure that it's in the trust for her benefit. But after her time, it doesn't just go to her kids. It can actually go to David.
I think on this point, it's helpful to just pause here and really explain, because sometimes I think most people may think the will, I have it,
Yeah.
right? So what is the risk, right? And sometimes people do get confused or are unsure of in what circumstance a will versus a trust might be bigger play. And I think this is a good example.
Yeah.
And can you maybe just explain that again?
Yeah.
Why in this case a trust would be a better mechanism in a companion to the will versus just having a will?
Yeah, absolutely. So a will dictate after, God forbid, if something was to happen to you, who can be the beneficiaries of your assets as one part of that. But what it doesn't do is, let's say, okay, if something happened to David, it's very possible for the will to say, hey, the assets now go to Lena, for example. But what it doesn't do is you're not able to, or David cannot control what happens after Lena passes away, because if Lena now inherits the assets, it's based on what Lena's decision in terms of how she wants to create her will, for example. And they may have had a will from the get-go, but what's stopping Lena from changing what happens after David passes away? Because then it's actually going to go based on what Lena's will does, Lena's will dictates, and it can ultimately disinherit David's children because Lena may not care to be able to pass assets to David's children, right? So versus a trust, you can have preset instructions into that trust, which says, hey, especially a spousal trust, until Lena is alive, Lena can use the property and enjoy the property. But if something was to happen, or even if she was to remarry, for example, the asset doesn't go to her new spouse. It has to go to these kids or these beneficiaries in a preset format.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful because that distinction often comes up. People are unsure. They know what it is, but they're not sure the mechanism and how each of these would be applied.
And I'll also maybe quickly add as well, just sometimes the cost benefit has to be taken into consideration as well, because it is a bit more costlier to set up a trust, to manage a trust, for example. But there are certain solutions called, like, for example, a testamentary trust is a trust that you can have instructions in a will to say, hey, we don't need to create this trust today. But the instruction in the will say when one spouse passes away or when both spouses pass away at that time, we'll need to create a trust, because there's no point in creating a trust today if the cost benefit doesn't make sense, but it may have a lot of other factors like the ones we described to be able to create a trust when an event happens.
Got it. Sounds good.
The second part of something that we looked at was who the executors of those estates are, because it is very important to make sure. It's very normal to have the other spouse as the executor, but in David's and Lena's case, if David is the executor and if Lena was to pass away, for example, what's stopping David from acting not in good faith towards Lena's children if he's the executor, for example, right? So it's probably, we considered having neutral executors as well as co-executors, just people who would act in the best interest of all parties around. So that was one of the solutions that we looked at. We did look at clearly documenting the intent between David and Lena through the lawyers that we worked with, because what we wanted to avoid was any type of spousal claims or even claims on the estate if something was to happen in the future. So we wanted to make sure while they are around, they clearly documented exactly how assets were going to be passed down from that perspective. We definitely did some beneficiary and asset designations and just kind of saw who the beneficiaries are, who the owners of the assets are, because if we had joint owners on certain properties, it'll automatically go to the other spouse. So we wanted to be able to avoid that, and we wanted to intentionally design certain things. We definitely looked at was making sure there was enough resources for Lena to be able to take care of her parents as well as her child if something was to happen, and the beneficiaries are not forced to sell their assets to be able to fund those child care needs or ongoing care. So we wanted to intentionally design that. And then the last piece of it was just really looking at liquidity. If something was to happen to either one of them, is there going to be sufficient cash flows to be able to help fund their lifestyle at that point? So we considered insurance solutions that really fit in nicely for that part of the solution, because what we wouldn't want is for either Lena or David to be forced to liquidate some of their assets, capital market stock portfolio, if the markets were not favorable at that time. So we wanted to see, and really making sure Lena's parents are funded or their care are funded for, we really wanted to make sure there were solutions which can inject a huge amount of capital in case something happens at some point or the other, so that there's enough liquidity in that perspective.
Sounds good. So the real impact then, we always talk about the value of intentional planning versus your planning just be a byproduct of an event happening, right? Yeah. So without the intentional planning, there seemed that there was a high risk of disputes between families, right? Which in some cases could be inevitable. In some cases, that risk is there. Uncertainty for children and dependents, estate erosion through legal fees, and emotional stress, which is always underrated during these times, during already a difficult time. Now adding the compounding nature of estate stress during this period. And with wealth bridge planning, you mentioned that there's a difference between treated fairly and equally. And so we have a strategy here where all children are now treated fairly, not just equally. Dependents protected with clarity and dignity. Estate intentions are clearly documented, which is very important, and the risk of conflict has been significantly mitigated through a strategy like this. And so that was very helpful, I think, the way you explained it and kind of identified the key risks. So from your perspective, as an estate planner, what did this strategy achieve?
Yeah, so for us, it was just to make sure that estate planning is rarely documents. There's the technical pieces of it. Of course, you want to make sure you have the right documents. But ultimately, we wanted to make sure we can intentionally design outcomes that are fair for, obviously all the parties involved, and make sure it actually is what the family ultimately wants. So we want to make sure we came up with solutions that ultimately accomplished a lot of that things, or a lot of the goals that the family had, and just making sure it's documented in the right way.
For people watching this video who may in part or in whole or to some degree relate to the circumstance of the case study, right? What would your advice be for them?
Yeah, like if your family includes like either a blended family or let's say there's a wealth disparity between the two partners, what I would ultimately suggest is, it's nothing to stress over, but I think it is worthwhile having a conversation to see if you can intentionally design certain outcomes that will ultimately achieve all the goals that you have as a family. Feel free to reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to help you out.
Perfect. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.